Hi, and welcome to Nothing is Rocket Science, a podcast where we discuss the nuances of science behind everything that we see in our daily life. I am Sandhya Shekhar, and this is my co-host Smriti. So, Smriti, on to you.
Yes, very happy to have Dr. Marika with us. She's been a good friend. I had the opportunity to meet her in person once, and then we've been keeping in touch via email because we have a lot of common interests in terms of meditation, cognitive science, neuroscience, and such intersection areas. So, just to introduce Marika to the audience, she is an assistant professor of cognitive modeling in the University of Groningen in Netherlands, and she has a PhD in neuroscience, and also she did her postdoc at Princeton University. And she has pretty interesting research questions in terms of how do we think, in what ways do our mind wander, and what affects our decision making, and how can contemplative practices such as meditation or mindfulness help us in this adaptive way of thinking. In fact, she has a wonderful blog that talks about science, meditation, and dance. In fact, so she's an excellent ballet dancer herself. So I think she has this proper balance of art and science within her, and in fact the interconnecting meditation as well. So I think the first question probably is how do you connect science, meditation, and dance? That I think our audience would be very happy to learn from you about that.
Yeah, well, I think they connect on two levels for me. On the one hand, they are all important for me to stay happy and healthy. So I think, well, especially in this pandemic, I think we have to think about what makes us stay healthy and stay inspired while we're in whatever circumstances we are. And for me, having physical activity is really important. And for me, dance is the most natural expression of that. And for me, meditation is also really important because otherwise I think my mind would just be completely wild and uncontrolled. And it allows me to deal with my mind in a, I think, more adaptive way. And then on the other level, in terms of scientific investigation, I mean, I really like to study those things as well, because my fundamental curiosity is really just how does the mind work? And I'm very grateful I get to study that as a scientist. But then I don't only study that as a scientist, I also look at the things that can affect the mind, which with a particular emphasis on meditation and dance, because I have, from my own personal experience, I think those are different ways that different methods to influence or change the mind. And then actually, on the other hand, also dance and also meditation can be different ways of knowing. So there's the scientific knowing, but then there is also the contemplative knowing and the artistic knowing. So I think in that sense, they are all related and they just get at this fundamental understanding of the mind and who we are as humans from many different perspectives.
Yeah, in fact, what you're doing is very interesting in terms of the outside-in perspective and the inside-out perspective as well. Because neuroscience looks at it from an outsider's perspective, where you put electrodes or you give cognitive exercises to do. But then these contemplative practices also help us to look from within to outside as well in terms of the experiences that we go through. So I think that's a very significant work, and I feel that that's what the world needs in terms of the pandemic situation as well, because the more and more the scientific basis of such practices get established, then there are more adopters. Some get convinced at the emotional level, some get convinced at the intellectual level. So that way, these scientific aspects really help in convincing people of the efficacy or the efficiency of such practices. Wonderful, wonderful. Sandhya, over to your questions also. Sure. Please.
Maybe just one thing I want to add there is that this is probably one reason why I'm really interested in the study of mind wandering, because it is probably the one field of neuroscience and cognitive science where we really take the subjective very seriously and do it also in a very rigorous and controlled way. So I think that's very interesting. And then on the other hand, I'm a big proponent in terms of looking at the efficacy of contemplative practices, such as meditation and mindfulness and all of those things that, well, you know, as a scientist, I can think about possible mechanisms and all of that, but I really hope that my work can really mostly be an invitation for people to check it out for themselves, because we can, in the end, I mean, it's got to be different for everyone, what works, what doesn't. And I think people have to be their own judge. They shouldn't just, you know, follow science like a religion. They should really be their own scientist, maybe even. And like, there's a beautiful image by Francisco Varela of our mind as a portable laboratory. And I think actually, in a way, many contemplative practices are like that. Like, you play around with your mind and you see what is the effect of using it in different ways, and how does that allow us to be a better human being, or maybe what doesn't work. And in that way we learn. And that's in the end what it's about. It's not some magic that can descend upon us like from above. It's really like we have to explore ourselves and do it ourselves.
In fact, in the yogic tradition, the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali gives a beautiful map of the first-person account of Patanjali Maharishi, where he talks about the different states of consciousness and different pathways that the mind goes through when one adopts yogic practices, and the impact on the body and the mind. So that way, as you say, it becomes a portable laboratory for each one of us to sort of practice, understand, and bring it out as research, bring it out as learnings, and so many other things. Yeah. So over to Sandhya for your questions. Yes.
Yeah, so again, these questions are a mix of, you know, from a perspective, what the general audience wants, and also a couple of things that I was personally interested in. So I thought, why not ask the expert? So the first is what we just started off talking about. Why does the mind get distracted? Like, why does mind wandering happen? And how does this affect you know, our decision making? So can you tell us about, you know, some of your research that you've done on these kind of topics? So if you can explain to us why our mind wanders and how that affects our decision making.
So I think mind wandering is not bad at all. It's actually very good that the mind wanders, because otherwise we would be stuck. Like, it would not be a good idea, a good situation. And so our mind wanders because you know, it's always important when you're doing something to make sure that you check out also, you know, is this still the best thing to do? And sometimes, you know, we can do multiple things at the same time. Like, if we're walking through the park, it's not that necessary to be like a zombie and to just focus on how our feet are walking in the park, right? I mean, we could, if we were interested in training our minds to focus on the movements of our feet. But, you know, we could also use that time to let our minds explore new venues and get new ideas. So there's been some research that links mind wandering to creativity. I myself have done some research showing that when people are doing a particular task and there is some mental space available, you could say, then they start to use it for planning, which then improves their performance on an upcoming task, on a subsequent task. So I think we are very, very smart, and mind wandering is just a way in which we are very smart. And our mind is, I think, continuously sort of regurgitating ideas and recent experiences, and then mind wandering allows us to recombine these ideas and thereby come up with sort of new viewpoints, synthesizing knowledge, relating it to other things. So it's not at all bad. The moment it goes bad is, for example, when it turns into depressive rumination, where or maybe addictive craving, or those kind of things where our mind gets so fixated on a certain idea. When, you know, you're depressed, you might have all these intrusive thoughts of I'm worthless, and you know, my life is going terrible, and I can't, this is never gonna lead to anything. I mean, then we cannot focus on anything and our thoughts are continuously pulled to these ideas. Now, obviously that doesn't allow us to function well, but just normal, getting distracted by something that might actually bring us in a different mental space by which we can then, when we're trying to make a decision, we can look at it from these different angles. So it's actually overall probably not that bad, but often, of course, when we construct laboratory tasks in which we measure mind wandering, we set up these very contrived, very simple situations. So it's simple enough for us scientists to deal with in a lab, but they are really just then sort of it's also natural that people start to mind wander, because I literally would have you as a participant maybe do a task where I would show you numbers and you would have to press a button whenever you see the number and indicate whether that it's a number just as quickly as possible, except when it's the number 3, then you should not press the button. So this is a very, very simple decision called a true alternative forced choice decision. But obviously it's so rarefied, not at all like the complex decisions that we use in our everyday life. So then it's also quite healthy, I would say, that you meanwhile start to think about, what are you going to have for dinner or something like that. So yeah.
So it's different from distraction, which is definitely not very constructive. Like you mind wandering, you're thinking about other tasks, but distraction is something that is keeping you away from what you're supposed to finish. And so how does that come into play, and how does that affect our why does that happen?
Yeah, well, so distraction is typically, I mean, they're related to mind wandering, also depending on how you define all those things.
Right.
So, I mean, in a way, maybe you could say mind wandering would be distraction by your own thoughts. But I mean, distraction is always defined in terms of what is our main task. But actually, there can be so many main tasks. Like if I'm sitting there in the lab, then if I'm thinking about like what I'm going to have for dinner, that would be considered to be a distraction from the stupid task that I asked you to do in the lab. But actually, in a way, it's a very adaptive refocusing on the task of life. So it's in that sense, maybe it's not that much of a distraction. And similarly, if we're practicing meditation, you could say instead of like most meditation practices, we would be focusing on the breath. And then we would say we're distracted if we're suddenly focusing on some other memories or thoughts or plans. But in a way, it's also not that bad, because this is the natural thing that the mind does. And I find, for example, very often that when I'm practicing meditation and I get distracted, that I actually come up with new viewpoints on this, and I'm solving problems of something that's happening next. So also there, I don't think it's necessarily that bad.
Right.
Yeah, I just have one small thing in this. In fact, Marieke, she computationally models mind wandering, and that's very fascinating to me. So can you just touch upon that a little bit as to how do you actually computationally model mind wandering? Because that's something that's happening inside our head, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So actually, I mean, the fun bit here is, of course, that it's more difficult to make a computer mind wander than to make a computer stay focused, because that's what computers do. And maybe that's also why they're relatively stupid, because they don't have this idea generating process that we as humans have. So what I need to do to model this is I need to create a model of the computer doing the task, maybe the one that I just described, like where you make decisions about whether a digit is the digit number 3. And then on top of that, I need to make a model of the distraction process where in my model, I simulate it as a retrieval of memories from recent times that, one is retrieved after the other, and the two are in competition. Like that's, I think, how it normally also works. And we see actually in brain studies that just prior to you getting distracted, that your medial temporal lobe, which is sort of the memory generation machine in your brain, is turning on. So they did this very interesting study with meditators who were lying in the scanner, and then whenever they realized they were distracted or mind wandering, they had to press a button, and then they looked at what happened just before they pressed the button. So when they started to get when they were distracted and then noticed they were distracted, and they found that at that time, just a few seconds before that time, their medial temporal lobe was going on. So yeah,
That's pretty interesting. And being a vision science researcher, I understand those concepts, because I think when you say medial temporal, it's the V5 that you're talking about, right? The V5 area of the brain.
No, it's a little bit more deep. It's more like the hippocampus and the
Okay.
the parahippocampal gyrus and those kind of areas.
All right. Since we spoke about meditation, my next question was, what is mindfulness, and is meditation is it synonymous to meditation, or like are they different, and how do you differentiate? What is mindfulness?
Right. Oh, that's a very challenging question. It depends a lot on who you ask. So I would say probably we should ask Smriti maybe. But anyway, I would say in scientific discourse, mindfulness, traditionally, strictly speaking, would be referring to the mindfulness-based stress reduction intervention invented by John Kabat-Zinn, which is sort of a secular intervention derived mostly from Buddhist sources, but of course based on a wide variety of contemplative influences. Nowadays, if you look into scientific research, you also see that sometimes other interventions are labeled as mindfulness. It's typically used as a sort of to indicate, well, this is a secular intervention rather than one derived from a religious tradition. And so this is why, like because in the early 2000s, this field really sort of took flight, and that was because it was suddenly being, you almost say, branded as a secular intervention, and we're going to do serious science on this, and that's why, and we're going to make a very controlled manualized intervention, and that's why we call it mindfulness. But it's probably, I mean, its pure sense, it would be like a set of practices that are really about learning to focus on a particular stimulus, mostly the breath, but it could also be sensations or other objects. I mean, the 4 foundations of mindfulness in the Buddhist traditions, I think, are a big fundamental cornerstone of the mindfulness-based stress reduction intervention. And it's not just about being focused, but really also then learning to realize when you are no longer focused, because as I said, our mind naturally starts to move to other things, and that's not bad, that's very healthy. But then what you learn in these practices is to gently recognize that your mind has gone somewhere else, and then to gently bring it back, but also to do that not angry at your mind, to really in a Buddhist tradition I'm familiar with, they also call it like becoming friends with your mind, and I think that's a very beautiful way of saying it. And then meditation tends to be used more as an umbrella term for many more contemplative practices, for many more traditions. I mean, all religious traditions in the world have these kind of practices. I tend to, because there's all kinds of associations with meditation, that some people are like, this is a very wishy-washy thing or a very hippie thing. I tend to prefer to use the term contemplative practice, which has a little bit less of that baggage associated with it. But yeah, it's of course, and this then doesn't have to look like somebody sitting on a cushion watching their breath. It can be having many, many different forms.
Right. Like, for example, like sitting down and meditate, like the actual process of meditation is considered meditative, but like when you pursue something like swimming or deep water diving, for a few of them, they consider that to be a meditative process, because I think ultimately they're achieving what they want to achieve, like calming the mind or watching their thoughts. I think it's so basically, like you said, when anything can be meditative, anything that you do passionately or anything that calms your mind can be meditative, and they all come under the umbrella of meditation or mindfulness, right?
Yeah, although I
I
would
just,
say that in these
sorry,
cases,
go ahead.
like swimming or so, I would say that they are mostly a practice of becoming absorbed in a certain mental state and not being just focused on that, and also learning to focus on that and keeping the distractions out. Whereas typically most forms of meditation, and even in a mindfulness-based stress reduction course, the objective is also to get insight into the way the mind works. Or the way the world works. So that's a little bit more profound. By looking at the mind, you, for example, in mindfulness-based stress reduction, it's not emphasized, it's not really talked about that much, but it is clear in the instructions that, you know, you slowly, by looking at the mind for a sustained amount of time, you realize that it's fluctuating all the time. And that is typically a very profound realization, just like the realization that I am separate from my thoughts. So my thoughts can be going everywhere, but I can always step out of that. And those things would probably not naturally arise most of the time when you're like focused on swimming or playing the piano or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's
in fact, I
interesting.
just want to add something here. If you look at the yogic tradition, it talks about different stages or different components of the yoga system. So one is pratyahara, which is basically the withdrawal of the senses, where you withdraw the inputs from the senses, and that helps you to focus the or go inward. That's a stage. And then there is dharana, which is basically a single pointed focus. So once you are withdraw the senses, there is a single point focus where the mind is sort of tuned to focus on a single thing. And then there is meditation, where you can have an object or you do not have an object, but it's basically a consistent flow that happens within oneself. And then there is something called samadhi that happens, which is a very different state from all of these, where there can be pure awareness or there need not be any awareness of what is going on around. It will be a complete process of the inner state, actually. So I think mindfulness that way, I think it also brings a certain awareness, right? It's an awareness based practice. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, coming to my next question, how does meditation influence cognition and decision making at a, more like at a cellular molecular level? And if you can give us some research studies that highlight these positive outcomes. I mean, I don't want to use the word correlation because, you can find correlations, but it cannot be applicable. But anything that has highlighted a positive outcome.
Yeah, well, so I'm not sure, I'm not an expert on the molecular cellular level, so
Okay.
I don't think I can say something. And also, I don't think it's really possible to study that in the terms of meditation, because we can't really study molecules within living humans. And to know what human, like to study meditation, I guess you need humans that do it, and then you measure
Right.
something in their brains.
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, I would say what we do know about these practices is that the most convincing results I find are ones from studies of pain processing, where they found that when people are receiving pain stimuli, that after meditation interventions, mostly mindfulness interventions, that they still perceive the pain just like the non-meditator would do, but rather than getting very worked up about it, they would find it much less unpleasant than the person who does not have the meditation experience. And you can also see that the brain starts to respond differently to these pain stimuli. I would also say that the relatively strong results in treating depression with mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, so combination of mindfulness with cognitive therapy, where it's at least equally effective as antidepressant medication. So that's pretty good. I mean, all of that is not very good. I mean, we still have many people that we cannot treat with these means, but compared to everything considered, it's not too bad. And then there's also some research on the effects of meditation practices on attention. So that's what I've also been working on a little bit. And here the results, I think, are less clear. It tends to take a lot of practice before you tend to see strong effects on attention. So people need to study this for many years. And this makes the studies really difficult because you typically cannot rule out confounding factors. I mean, what kind of person does do these kind of practices for so many years? So yeah, I think there is definitely some indication, like you would expect, that it helps to improve attentional functioning and also helps people make more adaptive decisions. But yeah, it's very hard to study this.
Right. And yeah, that was why my next question was, how do you measure these outcomes, like, at a physical level? Because it is something that you experience. It's more like a gut feeling. How can I can't express my gut feeling. It's very subjective. So how do you measure these kind of results at a lab?
Yeah, so we do various things. On the one hand, we do intervention studies. So we measure people's brain, we measure people's behavior before going on a retreat and then after retreat again, and compare that to a control group that does something else, or maybe does yoga, like physical yoga, or does I don't know, some other kind of, maybe there's health education, for example. So people would be led to believe that both of these interventions are going to improve their brain, and then you see what's different. Another way in which this is studied is looking at the brain in its meditative states compared to when the same person is doing other stuff. So we're now planning a study where we're going to be looking at meditators and asking them, okay, now, start to worry about this, and now pay attention to your feet, and now pay attention to your breath. And then we'll ask them to practice meditation. And then we see, like, what kind of brain patterns do we observe when they're practicing meditation? Does it look more like a brain that's worrying about things, or does it more look like a brain that's paying attention to someone's breath, or those kind of things? So so you can look at the brain in these meditative states, but what's tricky there is that if we just find a particular brain pattern by itself without a subjective judgment, we cannot really conclude much. I mean, there are definitely studies like that, but I personally don't find them that convincing. You do need to have some subjective or objective other measurements that can have give some indication of what this brain state actually means. And therefore also things like behavioral tasks are very helpful, and sometimes also repeated questionnaires in which people are asked about their emotions, or even so-called phenomenology studies where people are asked really detailed questions about their subjective experience. So yeah, those are all kinds of outcome measures that are used.
That's interesting. And I read that you did some research with Tibetan monks. So can you tell us, something about that? And that sounds very interesting.
Yeah, so that's actually the reason I ventured to India and met Smriti. So I have been collaborating for about 6 years now, I guess, with Tibetan monks in South India, who are practicing a more reasoning-based meditation and monastic debate. So it really looks quite spectacular, where monks are shouting at each other, dancing around each other, but actually engaging in a very disciplined exchange of knowledge, where they're trying to figure out basically what does it mean to adopt a certain philosophical position, and what is that consistent with, and what is that inconsistent with, and how can you look at this from many different angles. So when I saw this practice happening, I was like, wow, that's really interesting. It's a very different kind of practice than the ones that most people think of when they hear the word meditation, or when they hear the word contemplative practice. And yet this is the kind of practice that these monks do for 5 hours a day. And moreover, the kind of practices that have produced people like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who clearly is a pretty well-adapted person, to say the least. So there must be something going on there, and what are they doing, and how can we measure that? And the other cool thing of this study is that it's both a study for me as a scientist together with the other Western scientists to learn more about these practices, but also at the same time, it functions as a science teaching project for the monks who learn about the methods of science through being involved in this research.
In fact, you did put in practice some of your learnings from those sessions into your classroom as well, right? Maybe you can share that.
Yeah, well, I've done some experiments for sure with trying to use this debate method that the monks are using, where they really say, okay, we take this position, and then the other person is asking questions about that position, you could say, in a very simple way, and they're, you know, clapping, which always makes it more fun with the students. And we try to use that for statistics. It wasn't a complete success because I think it's quite surprisingly difficult to get students to learn to ask good questions. But I think there will be, once we figure out how to better teach that, I think there will be interesting applications in a classroom situation.
And you know, obviously there is a lot that's being studied, and but at a personal level, I'm pretty sure, or at like from people's experiences, I know that it has some positive effect. So, do you think it is prudent, or like, is it wise to make it mandatory in schools, or when is the right time to start this kind of a practice? And is it a wise decision to introduce this as a part of curriculum, so that, you know, there are a lot of advantages? If do you think there are any disadvantages to introduce this as a compulsory, subject at school, or a subject, compulsory practice, or, you know, when is the right time to start this kind of a practice?
Yeah, so I think this is a complicated discussion. I would be strongly against making it compulsory for one thing, because the moment you make something compulsory, many students are not going to like it as much.
Interested, yeah.
And then in the US, it's very complicated with all kinds of religious freedom kind of things, for example. So and nevertheless, I mean, there have been movements to implementing mindfulness in schools, and the UK has been doing a lot of that as well, where it's especially useful for kids to learn to manage their emotions. And I would see some potential there. So, but at the same time, I think you need to really think carefully about how to adapt it so that it makes sense for kids. And also, there is emerging research that for many people it's beneficial, but for some people it's actually, there's also bad side effects of these practices. So I mean, ranging from just mild doubts about what's the meaning of my life, to being confused, to even like psychotic states. So I think it's not like mindfulness is completely harmless, and especially when it's given without context and bigger perspectives. Yeah, so I think that's important too. I mean, there's a reason why I think traditionally in many of the places where it's practiced, it is done with a teacher, with a community, and those are really important parts as well. So I would say let's take it slowly. Let's try out different things, that what works, what doesn't, and build up the evidence base, and also keep monitoring for maybe side effects that aren't so desirable. Also, kids are, of course, they're growing up, so it's important to be careful with them as well. On the other hand, you also do want to, if there's something beneficial, you don't want to not give it to them, but yeah.
How did you get into this? Like, what made you decide that I'm going to study this, or I'm going to research about? I mean, there are a lot of people who are studying neuroscience, but there's maybe a handful of them studying neuroscience and meditation. So is it like a personal, something, because you've been practicing meditation for quite some time? So what made you decide that you're going to marry both your passion and your profession?
Yeah, well, I guess it was the moment that I realized that this was even possible. So I started practicing meditation when I was about 17 or so. And then I became a student a little bit later and realized that I wanted to do something with neuroscience at age 22 or so. And then I was actually, the moment I think the idea was really born was when I was traveling through India and Nepal in a gap year after my bachelor degree. And I came across this book from Daniel Goleman called Destructive Emotions. And that was about a dialogue between the Dalai Lama and scientists about the practice of meditation. And I was like, wow, that's really cool. That's what I want to do. So that's when the idea was born. And then it took a couple more years before the possibility, the opportunity came to actually do it. And then slowly I've been keeping it as a part of the work in my lab. I mean, especially at that time in the early 2000s, it wasn't like, it was something that scientists would say, well, you know, doing this is career or suicide. So probably focusing your entire research on this is not a good idea. So I was like, okay, I'll do it as a side topic. And nowadays it's much more accepted to do it. So
Right.
I have a decent portion of my lab doing research around this, but definitely also do still more conventional, normal research. Yeah.
That's interesting because, yeah, like you rightly said, it's only from maybe the early or the late 2000s that it is being looked at as, or at least it's being researched upon. Until then, it was, you know, called like pseudoscience, mumbo jumbo. And yeah, so I'm pretty sure, like, what do you think has caused that change? Like, why did people start exploring this? Okay, this needs to be researched. Although I think a lot of them have seen at a personal level that they have seen some kind of a change, but what made that shift from exploring to accepting that this is, yes, this is science, and yes, there is some effect?
I think it was when this mindfulness-based stress reduction intervention was developed, at least, well, of course, I'm speaking entirely from the Western perspective because that's what I know, like the Western academic perspective. But yeah, at that time, suddenly it became something from a random, you know, religious thing that, you know, it's very hard to study such a thing scientifically because it's so many components, like you cannot bring that into the lab. Whereas if you have a manualized intervention that you can reproduce, that people feel like is not a religious thing, because, you know, then it comes with all kinds of complexities that are then not possible to reproduce in the lab. I think that was the moment really that people are like, okay, yeah, we can study this scientifically and we can start to develop theories about what's going on there. And of course, it's still a limited perspective on what is happening and what these practices are. But it is, at least you can have some basis from where to theorize and from where to experiment, because the whole cornerstone of scientific research is really reproducibility. So trying something that you can do, but then also the other person can try out in their lab and then hopefully get similar
Repeatability.
results. So yeah.
That's, yeah. And you know, I know we touched upon depression and you know, the effect on this. So
Before
if you
that, I
can,
just have
sure,
before that,
yeah,
I
go ahead.
just have one thing related to what she said just now. So whenever it comes to research in areas like, for example, meditation or whatever, related areas, there's always this question of, subjectivity and objectivity. Of course,
Right.
I myself have been involved in this research. So internally, I'm sort of resolved. But with respect to the audience watching this program, I think if Marieke could touch upon that subjective aspect and the objective aspect when it comes to this kind of research, and how she resolves this within herself, then probably it would be good.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a great question. And I would say in the beginning, most of the research was really focused on the objective, like measuring something in the brain, just to show that, we could have an objective measure that would change as a function of these practices, or, cognitive tasks where we would show differences in response time or so. Then actually those are, as anyone probably who does these practices themselves know, is that, you know, a lot of these measures are not really getting at the core of probably what's being changed. And what's really being changed, I mean, I remember at one of these Mind and Life Institute dialogues, which are about the research on contemplative practices, somebody, I think it was Richie Davidson, was saying something like, well, you know, we can see in people that things are changing, that you can see it in their eyes, or the fluidity, their sort of their radiance, and we don't know how to measure that. Now, subjective states might be a little bit better at capturing that in some respects than many of the objective attention measures. So this is why that's of interest. And then on top of that, there was the parallel scientific development of, I guess, at the end of the 2000s, this research on mind wandering started to take off, where the big innovation was that previously subjective states had been studied by asking a person, say, at the end of a task, like, what happens, you know, but they've been doing a task for an hour. So obviously that's not going to be very reliable, because people forget like what happened in the whole hour. Now, the innovation was that rather than asking a person about the whole hour, there were these thought probes that were embedded in the task. And a thought probe is literally just a question that asks you, like, what are you thinking about just now? Was it about the task, or your thoughts, or your feelings, or whatever? And you can ask them all kinds of questions. And then you can relate that to what's happening in the brain, in the physiology, in task performance, right at that very moment. So obviously that's much more reliable. And that allowed us to then investigate also the subjective dimension in a more controlled way. And this is also why in my lab, I've been in the last couple of years really started to think more about a dimension of the mind that I like to call stickiness, which is, you know, a kind of mental state that's quite difficult to disengage from. So sometimes our mind feels very sticky and it just gets, it gets stuck on something. And I feel like meditation practice is really helping to reduce that subjective stickiness. So I've been thinking about how can we measure that in the lab, and you know, for example, how can we induce a sticky state, which is by asking people, for example, to think about themselves and especially self-related worries. That seems to be quite helpful for getting into the sticky state. And then we can look at, once we know how to generate that, we can look at, okay, what changes in their behavior, what changes in their brain, what changes in their eye movements. So I guess it's these developments that allowed us to also study the subjective more.
Interesting. Yeah, this is, I'm pretty sure we can talk a lot about in depth, and but yeah, due to the lack of time, um, yeah, my next question was about, you know, we're talking about stress and depression, you know, from a science, from a research point of view, what kind of effects are seen in, I don't want to say patients, because, you know, it's not a diseased condition, for people who have chronic stress and like depression. How is that? How do you think, from a personal point, from a personal experience, and also as a researcher, um, what are the positive, like, how do people suffering from stress and depression, how are they able to overcome it, or to what extent does meditation and mindfulness help them in overcoming these states?
Well, I would say that stress and depression are continuous challenges. Like, it's not like you can cure these once and for all. And
Right.
The one reason is that stress and depression are not just caused by a particular sort of malfunction of the mind that we can fix. It's a combination of many factors that cause this, which
Right.
also include external circumstances. And you cannot control those, or, well, you may also need to deal with those. Like, if a person is working in a environment at work where they're being bullied, then even if you fix their mind, maybe they can deal a bit better with the bullying. But to prevent stress, you would probably also need to deal with the bullying on top of that,
Right.
as well.
Right.
So I think it's a bit tricky to just blame almost like the individual for, their mind malfunctioning. And I think this is a criticism also sometimes on the mindfulness interventions. Like now all kinds of companies are offering mindfulness to fix the problem that they have created by overworking their employees. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Having said that, you can probably many of these practices help you to deal with whatever stress and challenges come your way, often in a bit more adaptive way. So on the one hand, for example, in mindfulness-based stress reduction, it's called mindfulness-based stress reduction. So it has practices including breathing, focusing your mind on an object, that tends to relax the mind and the physical body, and especially also the breathing and actually physical yoga, that, those are very powerful ways to just, bring the adrenaline down and just the physical excitement of the body. And on the other hand, just becoming more familiar with our mind and realizing that, oh, here I go again, in these thought cycles, realizing that there's a thought cycle and that I can actually step out of that. That doesn't mean that I will immediately never be caught in that again, because this is a practice that takes a long time to slowly become, make your mind pliable, as that would be said in many of these traditions. But, we can slowly cultivate, I think, these qualities of realizing that it's just our mind and we have some agency here as well. So I think it's always important to see it's not just one factor that we can change. It's an interdependent system.
Right. And I think it's very human that, we always think of the worst case scenario, even though it's not the case. So yeah, I think once you're aware of that, it takes a lot of time to get to that awareness. And also it's difficult to stay in that kind of an awareness when you're facing the situations. Yeah, you're completely right. And before we move on to the last topic, I just wanted some tips, like for people who want to get into this. I know there are a lot of videos online, and there's a lot of avenues where people are offering meditation and training and stuff. So if you want to start off with something very simple, what are some good exercises to understand, or how to start with this, and how to start the whole habit of um, you know doing meditation or practicing mindfulness?
Yeah, so I would say that I'm most familiar, like one commonly accessible tool is the Headspace app that I know is quite good in general. And on top of that, you could also just what I often tell my students when I'm giving a brief talk about this kind of research is I would just invite people to take a few moments, take a few minutes to just observe your mind with kind curiosity and just see what happens. That's like, in my mind, sort of the most fundamental practice. Maybe bring your attention to your breath so you have something to do. Right. And then just observe your own mind and play around with that, and maybe also see whether you can notice sometime during the day like what's going on, and that immediately also puts you outside your own mind because you're now observing your mind rather than being in the midst of it. And then the final tool that I think is very helpful is practice of loving kindness for yourself, because I think nowadays, especially in the stress of the modern world, even these thoughts of like, I should be mindful and I should be productive and I should not be distracted. It really creates sometimes even more stress than before. So the simplest loving kindness practice is just that you take a moment to quiet yourself down, and then you repeat these phrases to yourself like, may I be happy, may I be well, may I live with ease. And you say that in a very spacious way, and you try to, feel that. Sometimes it can be actually surprisingly challenging for many of us, especially maybe in the modern world where we're almost taught to not love ourselves in this very fundamental way. And that's why they're so important and so powerful. And then you can also bring these same sentences to wish well to others. And I think just those simple practices, so paying attention to your breath and watching your mind with kind awareness, as
Right.
well as these loving kindness practices. And you can use these sentences, you can use any other good wishes for yourself and for others. May I be happy, may I be healthy, may I not have so much stress, or any of those things. For yourself and others, I think they can be very profound.
Yeah, like positive affirmations.
Yeah, you could say
Yeah.
so. Yeah.
Interesting. Smriti, do you want to add anything else before we move on to the next segment? Okay. So this is to do with your classical ballet dance, and I didn't go through everything into this, but I thought it'd be interesting if you could talk about how I saw that you did research about dance and then the brain activity. So if you can let us know some if you can tell us something about that, about your dance and how the brain activity,
Yeah.
is it during or is it after? If you can, yeah.
Well, yeah, so I myself have been doing research on the particular topic of the synchrony between two brains of people moving together, dancing together. In fact, I'm still working on that, so I don't have any final conclusion, nothing published yet, because it's a very challenging thing to study. So we're slowly going through and doing many different analyses to make sure that we're finding something reliable. But basically, the idea here is that in general, when you measure the brain activity of two individuals, it's been found that when you're collaborating or doing something together, then your brains tend to synchronize for more collaboration. It's as if you're trying to simulate what the other person is doing, and then of course your brain looks the same because you're sort of going through the same mental state. So it's not like anything magical, I think. It's just like your brain is doing similar things. And so we were curious whether moving together, and especially using movement to connect to the other person, whether that would synchronize brains. And so far, well, we do know for sure that subjectively speaking, if we ask people how connected do you feel, then we found that the strongest way to connect to another person through movement was to move as if you were having a single body. So we asked people to touch the other person and then imagine you had a single body. So that was very powerful. And the other way that was very powerful was to move in a dialogue. So one person would make a movement and the other would respond in another movement. So not necessarily the same movement. It would be like a dialogue, like we're having now in a way. And then we did find some changes in the synchrony between the brains as a result of that as well. But exactly what brain areas, and that's still being worked out. So yeah, but that's of course just one very small part about dancing brains. There's not that much research on dancing brains because it's very complicated to do this, since it's hard to turn this into a reproducible intervention that you can bring in the lab. And then there's additional technical complications of the moment somebody is moving. This tends to create artifacts in many measures of brain activity. And well, you cannot even measure somebody's MRI while they're moving because you have to lie very still in the scanner. So I guess that's why we don't have as much research on this.
Is this similar to why, when two of them are conversing, like one of them tries to copy the body language of the other person? So is it similar to that?
I would say probably those are very much related, so that we tend to copy the body language. Sometimes there's also some studies that I think show that people's heart rates tend to synchronize with each other when they're trying to understand each other. So there's lots of different ways that we tend to synchronize with each other when we're trying to connect and communicate and understand each other.
Right. This is like really interesting stuff, and I'm so glad that you were able to give us, time to discuss. I'm pretty sure we could have conversations in future about a particular topic, and maybe once you get the results of your research, we could probably talk about that. But thank you very much for giving us your time, and I'm pretty sure I was able to cover at least the questions that the general public would like to know, especially in terms of there's a lot of a lot of these words are being thrown around like mindfulness and meditation, and there's also a lot of misconceptions. So yeah, like before we end, probably if you could touch upon what are the misconceptions that people might have or people have about meditation and mindfulness.
Yeah, I would say the biggest one is that you have to make your mind blank when you're practicing meditation.
Right.
I would say, well, actually, most of the time you don't really want to do that. It doesn't sound very healthy. Like, it's very good. Our mind is aware and cognizing and understanding things. So probably that's the biggest one. And then also there's these like in the Western yoga magazines and mindful magazines that you just have to be mindful, well, with a blank state and just only being focused on the now. And it's like, oh, that's also again a very scary state, as if you're not allowed to think, which I think is actually a very healthy thing, and also to think critically is a very healthy thing. So yeah, I'd say those are the main things. And also, yeah, I guess the final thing is meditation and mindfulness, they're not a magic cure for anything. They're very helpful tools, I would say, for the most part. But yeah, don't believe that they're going to solve all your problems, because then you will also get disappointed. So it's so sad. Just, I would encourage everyone to try it out for themselves and see what works. And there's many meditation methods out there. So if one thing doesn't work for you, try another. Some people connect more with something that's moving their body. Others are like, no, sitting still. Others are like, I want to do something with my mind, like visualizing or using mantras or well, logical reasoning. And others are like, no, I'd rather just focus on my breath. And sometimes also, like one day I really like something that involves my body movement. Another day I really like the loving kindness practices, and another day I want to do a complex visualization because that's what I need that day. So there's so many methods out there, and of course, especially Smriti is an expert on this, I'm sure. And India has such rich traditions of all these contemplative practices. So I think we shouldn't get stuck in a small concept of what these practices are.
Right.
In fact, the Indian texts like Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, they talk about more than about 112 techniques of meditation and practice. I'm sure like there are thousands of ways that one can meditate.
And, yeah, I think in Buddhism they talk about 84,000 dharmas.
Yeah,
so just to scale it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's to each their own, whatever works.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you so much once again. It was great having you on our podcast. So to our subscribers, I hope you're liking the content that we're putting up. Please, you can write to us, and you can send us your questions, and I'll put up the blogs. I'll put up your blogs in my description. So in case if people want to go and check what you're doing, or if they want to write to you, they can directly write to you. So thanks again, and I hope, like I said, nothing is rocket science once you understand what's going on. So please like, share, and subscribe to our channel, and we have many such interesting topics coming up in the next few weeks. So thank you once again, and have a great day.